welcome everybody, and this is the third session. We started off with an introduction as to what the program's about. Specifically, we're looking at those issues that would contribute in terms of best practices to develop the national and regional action plans as called for by United Nations Environmental Assembly. But developing action plans is actually quite a tricky sort of thing to do. So what this program is supposed to do is to call in experts, and we've been very lucky with the experts who've agreed to come on board. And those experts then will give us an indication of the sorts of things that we should include within the action plans. And so the first session of last week, we were very fortunate that that Abu Bamba, who's essentially the executive secretary and head of the Abidjan Convention, welcomed us and actually stressed the importance of these issues. He was followed by Professor Linda Godfrey, who gave a really splendid indication of the issues as they are in Africa, using as the basis for the discussion the Africa Waste Management Outlook, for which she was in fact one of the senior authors. And so today we now move on to the first panel discussion, and I'm conscious of time because Thomas Maes is in fact going to leave quite soon because he has a competing activity. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and we're going to start with Thomas, and then Linda, and then Patrick. So Thomas, over to you, and if you wish to share your screen, you may do so. You'll need to unmute and then share your screen. So thank you all for being here, and good luck to the panelists, and we look forward to some great questions and answers afterwards. Thomas is going to leave us to answer his questions because he'll disappear.
Thank you very much, Tony, for the introduction. So I'm Thomas Maes from Grid Arendal, and I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation firstly, and to congratulate them for organizing these events because I think they're very useful. I'm also in great company with Linda and Percy, so I would remind everybody to hang on till the end. Also, I'll have to probably go on in half an hour because I've got another Arctic Plastic Symposium. So one of the benefits of the pandemic is that you can switch from South Africa to Iceland nowadays, but it also means my time is a bit limited. So this talk is going to be about primary drivers and sources of plastic waste, but also to try to talk about some of the experiences we've seen elsewhere or how can we use them in Africa. So over the years, I've been monitoring marine litter around the world. I've looked at macro and micro litter in beaches, water columns, seafloor, biota, you name it, we looked at it. And unfortunately, we found plastic everywhere. Any kind of plastic, any type of plastic, any type of items. It's just an issue that we lose stuff, and that stuff shows up in the environment. So when somebody loses an object, plastic object in this case, for example, it will get flushed off the land or blown off the land into a river, for example, or straight into the sea. And then depending on its density, it will sink rapidly to the seafloor, or it will keep floating in the water column on the surface. And eventually, it's a bit of a washing machine, the sea. It doesn't treat any, plastic otherwise than any other object it has to deal with. And so if we know that rocks become sediment, it's obviously that all these plastic eventually, given enough time, will fragment into smaller pieces, microplastics, nanoplastics even. And so that also means that some places where we monitor...
Et dans certains lieux également, nous avons également des matières plastiques qui sont en étape de transition et qui ne sont pas à une étape stable. Donc, ce sera un peu difficile d'être atteint. Ayant dit cela, et certaines des matières plastiques sont...
I think there are maybe some global average, but they're very unchecked and highly variable. So I think that what you find is mostly dependent on your local pressures and activities. If you're looking near big cities or large human settlements, you will find a lot of litter. And so one of the first models I did in my career, probably 2008 somewhere, we actually saw that about 90% of the items, once you release them from land, they will actually strand within 200 kilometers of that origin. So it means that beach litter is a very handy tool to sometimes indicate some of your sources. And so this weekend, I walked on the beach because I live near the beach, I'm luckily enough, and I'm living on a UK beach, of course, in the UK. But I found some items which clearly show you the pressures. So you see some of the stuff here. So it's very visual. You can see some of the strapping bands, some of the cable ties. lots of little pieces of ropes, which are probably pieces of nets, little chopped pieces off. So it clearly indicates there is a pressure here, and that pressure is the maritime industry. So fishing and shipping, for example. But that's not the only stuff you find. You quite quickly find hairbands, makeup brushes, some dummies, cigarette butts, and it shows you that also people, beachgoers, are littering. Next to that, I found quite some bottle caps, packaging, and so you see quite clearly there's another source here, which is our single-use plastics, which we use nilly-willy, but they end up in the environment if we don't treat them wise. Next to that, I found some sewage-related items, so you can see there are some inputs from sewage overflows, and I also found, of course, some fragments which are very old and very brittle, so they are probably the pieces which are transboundary. So based on this quick scoop, I could already indicate that I must be living in a small seaside town somewhere in Western Europe, judging on the amounts I found, judging on the types, but it clearly shows that the problem is everywhere. It's not just an African problem, it's a problem that will occur around the world, and depending on the amounts of plastic we use and the amounts of treatments we have for it, we will create some leakages. Ideally, we shouldn't have them, but there could be leakages from all kinds of industries, all kinds of practices. And so people often ask me, how does it actually come? Because we've got a good system. For example, London, I only dropped one item, they said, but it's one item and 10 million people. It quite quickly leads to a mountain of items. And so although we are stronger together, we're also much dirtier together. It's easy to clean my own waste, but if we start talking about cleaning the waste of 1 million or 10 million people, we will need some dedicated waste management infrastructures. We need some protocols to deal with it. Otherwise, it's quite obvious that if we use plastic unsustainably and in large quantities, we will create quite some leakages. And so it could mean that a country like Western countries, for example, high footprint of plastic, reasonably good waste management systems, although that's another discussion. And compared to, for example, Africa, low plastic footprint and no waste management, they almost create similar patterns because the high plastic and small leakage against almost no plastic but large leakage, almost equal. So in general, I think we can probably group solutions into 5 main ones. It's building awareness. People need to know what they're doing. They need to improve waste management. We need to drive capacity building and knowledge transfer. We need to establish funding, of course, because somebody needs to pay for some of this. We need to create legislation. We need to undertake research. And then, of course, after that, all of that, or together with it, we could do the cleanup, because otherwise the cleanup is just without no end. So there are different pressures, as I said, different activities. That it means there's going to be different solutions. Easiest is, of course, to maybe use plastic where it's essential, so we don't create the waste in the first place. But collection and separation are going to be useful, because if we don't collect and separate it, we cannot capture it. And let us be honest, in a world of growing food and resources demands, we can actually not get that waste to go to waste. We could use it, so we could compost the organics, we could recycle the non-organics. And so there will be a need to improve design, functionalities, maybe some modular repairs, or end of life needs to be kept in mind when we design some products. Because what works in our countries will not immediately work in another country. The best example here, although it's not African focused, so when people say, why don't we use sewage treatment in the Arctic? Well, it is because the water will just freeze. So we cannot just use a treatment center like we have in Europe, planted in the Arctic, and it will work. Well, that's just unlogical, because it's going to freeze solid. So we're going to have to look for local differences, local solutions and approaches on all levels where we can include everybody from the start. It doesn't need to be big and formal. It could be, for example, small scale and informal. And we need to look at whatever works best, list these options, share that knowledge, and develop some facilitation of those options. I've seen examples where dump trucks have been given to countries, but there was no road, so there was no way of using the dump truck. I've seen countries where they implement reusable diapers, but those people didn't have time to do the washing. There was no water, there was no time. They had to do shopping and other stuff. So I think we're going to have to look at behavior changes, but adapt them to the local circumstances, and start small, expand to local, agree regional, and then ultimately become global. Because I think a global agreement is in the making, and we got all the same problem, and we should have the same aim. That's it. Looking forward for your questions, and I'll pass it on to my next speakers, which I think is going to be Linda.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm glad you finished in time, because it means that you can answer your own questions. So are there questions, Tara?
I don't see any yet in the chat. Should we have the intro from the other 2 panelists first and then go to Thomas's questions?
I still have 15 minutes.
We can, yeah, because Thomas is going to run off. May I ask a question? Thomas, given that we are actually developing action plans for nations, national action plans as requested by UNEA, and then ultimately where countries have to work together for cross-border issues and other aspects. But let's look at a nation. What do you consider the highest priority in terms of developing action? So what are the three most important aspects that you would be looking at in terms of managing waste at source?
I think it's a good question. So I think, first of all, I would reduce. If you look at Europe, we use plastic everywhere. We use it in a lot of non-essential ways. So I think that's the first thing that you can learn from some of our regions is please don't use it if it's not necessary. It's not an ideal product, and the waste management is very costly and difficult. So the first part would be probably to reduce where we can. Secondly, I think we definitely need to collect it. Without collection and separation, it will just be one mixture and it's impossible to treat it or to do anything with it or to at least save some of the material. So I think the next bit would probably be separation. And then thirdly, I think we should probably also look at a better design. I think if we would design our products better with end of life in mind, we would facilitate the whole recycling process and it would allow much higher rates of recycling than we currently have. Nevertheless, I want to give a remark. Recycling is not the way out. We can only recycle a certain time, so it is only going to delay the whole process a bit, but it's not the final way. So I think those are the first three ones. I think the other one is probably research. I think if we don't know it, we can't solve it. And so measuring is still kind of knowing here, I think. And so by knowing it better, we can also target the measures better. I think that was a bit my top three.
Thank you, Thomas. I think in a way it's very interesting because you're coming from essentially a European background. In last week's discussion, Linda indicated that the work of the African Waste Management Outlook had shown that only 4% on average of plastics is recycled in Africa. But if there isn't some sort of end enterprise or end market, then there's no incentive to pick it up. So recycling and increasing the amount of recycling is one thing, but you say it's not necessarily the last thing. So we need to then move to an end market aspect. Given the African context, particularly West Africa, do you have any suggestions there?
Do you mean in a final market of plastic? I think plastic is actually going to lead to a lot of problems after we recycle it, because we can keep recycling until a limited amount of times, and after that we're going to have to find another solution again. However, I'm not thinking yet that this is the end. I'm hoping that technology will catch up, and if we refocus, as you say, and incentivize a bit more the recycling in the second-hand market, because at the moment a lot of these things are more costly than the original plastic product. I think we can probably steer away from producing more and trying to look better at how what we currently have can use that better.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. I think if you could stay on for a little while, and maybe questions will come your way before you go. And we're going to put Linda before Percy now. So Linda, could you please give your short presentation and then we'll move on to Percy. So thank you very much indeed, Thomas. We're going to hand over to Linda. So over to you, Linda, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Tony. I do see that there is one question, I think, that was posed to Thomas in the Q&A box. So I don't know if Thomas wants to take that one with regards to behavior change before I jump in.
Yeah, I think it's good. So I can see it here. So it's about behavior change and perception of local communities. I think it's pretty important that we, as I said, that we fine-tune it towards the local cultures, but also local kind of possibilities. It's not just something that we're going to plant from Europe and say this is going to work in Africa. So I think we have done a recent study in Grid Arendal not too long ago, where we did several workshops across Africa to just look at the perception of people. How do they perceive it? Does it match with what we find, or do they have different types of sources they think are important? The report gave us quite some nice answers. It's probably too long to just talk about it all here, but it will be produced pretty soon. So I think that behavior change and perception are going to be the key tools to actually make sure that we pick up those new techniques so that we implement them better. I hope it answers the questions. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Linda, for spotting it. I see there's another question. I'm not sure if that's also for Thomas. Righto, I have got to, I lost internet, internet dropped me for a moment, my apologies. Righto, the thing is, thank you for your presentation. I apologize if my question was already answered. Is there a study about carbon impact of zero waste solutions? In terms of plastic pollution, prevention is better, but how do we know that a zero waste world would be beneficial in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Right, that's quite a tough question to answer, because in a way, getting rid of plastics would be hugely inconvenient in many respects, but that might not be what you meant. Anyway, Thomas, I'm glad you have to answer that and not me.
Well, I think you've already touched on it. I think we have to be really careful with demonizing the product. Plastic has huge amounts of benefits, which there is no other product that probably can fit in that quickly. So I think we have to be really careful. We don't throw the child and the bathwater together away. We need to make sure that we use plastic where it's essential, that we find good ways to recycle or at least reuse that plastic so it becomes more circular. But I'm not advocating that we just kill off the whole of the plastic industry. I think there's too much good in there as well. So the impact of zero waste solutions, I don't think there are some studies out there at the moment. There are some studies who show you that some of the alternatives are not better. So just as a warning there, it's not that these, for example, cotton bags are better than a plastic bag. Cotton will use a lot of water. And so I think you have to look at life cycle analysis for every choice. And you have to think about it wisely, not just think, oh, this is not plastic, it will be better. It's exactly right that it might actually be worse for greenhouse gas emissions. So life cycle, which again, I think are key here to answer some of these questions.
Thank you very much. I don't see any further questions, so maybe this time we will get to Linda. I thought that was a very good question, partially answered last week by Linda as well, but it's certainly going to be a topic that I think we need to come back to, because in many ways plastic is fantastic. It's just what we do with the product after we've used it that is not so fantastic. So Linda, over to you, and thank you very much. And Thomas, if you do need to keep away before we get back to you, a sincere thanks, and we look forward to your attending more of the webinars in the future.
Thank you, Tony. I will be here for 8 more minutes.
Thank you.
Hi, Tony. Before, maybe I'm Abdullah Jagana. So sorry, I was muted and my speakers were muted. So thank you again for being here, Thomas. And thank you, Linda. Thank you, everyone. And just saying that I'm here and I'm listening carefully what you are saying, and hope this will help the Abidjan Convention to develop this regional framework and the national action plan for the. So thank you.
Great. Well,
Linda, that's the go ahead for you.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Well, also, just to reiterate what Thomas has said, a very big thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel. So in terms of this question, you know, what are the drivers and what are the sources of plastic waste? I think, you know, I'm going to take the perspective of land-based sources of plastic waste. I think Thomas has touched on the issue of ocean-based sources. And if one looks specifically at single-use plastic waste, which Thomas has alluded to as well, I think in my mind, there are two main drivers in terms of plastic waste and plastic pollution. And the first of these would be essentially the mismanagement of plastic at end of life. And the second one would be the growing consumption and use of plastic, which I think Thomas has touched on these two issues as well. But why do I say mismanagement of plastic waste at end of life as a driver of plastic pollution? Well, I think to highlight some of the points which we touched on last week for those that might have been part of that webinar was that we know that nearly half of all of the municipal solid waste generated in Africa is not collected. Now, yes, this can vary from city to city, from town to town. We have some cities where only 20% of the waste is collected, to other cities that are performing much better, where we have 80% or higher of the household or municipal waste collected. Now, if it's not collected, it means that citizens dump their waste in open spaces, they dump it on the side of streets, which will continue to pollute the environment, either through windblown litter or after a heavy rainfall event, it washes into a stormwater canal, or we also see often that people burn their waste, which causes air pollution. So the first issue in terms of mismanagement of waste is this point around waste is not collected. The second one is that we don't have comprehensive city cleaning in most of our cities or towns in Africa. So our open spaces, our roads, our sidewalks, our parks are not regularly cleaned, meaning again that we have windblown litter. After heavy rainfall events, the water can be washed into stormwater canals and it can leak into the environment. So the second issue around mismanagement is this one around city cleansing. And this is really, I always say this, is that city cleansing is the foundation of any waste management system. It's the first thing that you implement. The third point around mismanagement of waste is that we know that at least 90% of the waste that is collected, which again is a small portion, but at least 90% of what is collected is then disposed of to uncontrolled or controlled dump sites, where we have lack of daily compaction, we have limited to no daily cover of the waste, which again makes this waste mobile in terms of windblown litter, or again with rainfall events it can be washed off. And you know, if you've ever been to a landfill site or a dump site in Africa, very often you see in the open land next to it, you'll see plastic bags littering the fields, you'll see plastic bags and other types of plastic in the trees. So windblown litter, again, blowing the plastic off of these dump sites. And as Tony mentioned just now, we know that only 4% on average of plastic waste generated in Africa is actually recycled. So in other words, these combining issues, the fact that waste is not collected, the fact that we don't have proper city cleansing, that we're disposing of our waste to dump sites, we're not recycling much of it, really means, in my mind, that our municipal solid waste management system is broken in many of our cities and towns. And certainly when it comes to rural areas, it's often not existent at all. Now, when you combine this with the very real issue of increasing amounts of single-use plastic being used, and it's increasing because of changing consumption patterns, we have a growing middle class, we have population growth, we have increased urbanization. All of these issues drive the amount of single-use plastic that is actually used in Africa, as we're also seeing elsewhere in the world, for example. So these two drivers, the mismanagement of plastic because of a broken or failing waste management system and increasing amounts of plastic consumption. The result of these two issues is that we have more and more plastic leaking into the environment. And this is going to get worse and worse unless we improve our waste management system or unless we look at how we get products to consumers in different ways. And I think Thomas touched on this a little bit earlier. Can we reduce the amount of plastic actually being used? And certainly the concluding point from Thomas around the importance of tools like life cycle assessments or life cycle sustainability assessments in terms of informing how we actually package, for example, products, or how we get products to consumers. Now, we do see examples and we see pilot projects trying to address these two issues, trying to improve the state of waste management and trying to address consumption. Where we see waste management failing, we have examples of private entrepreneurs stepping in. We have social innovations popping up. We have equivalents of like Uber for waste. We have residents trying to take control of their own waste. We have a growing informal waste sector collecting waste. But I do believe that these activities, while they meet a short-term need, they do weaken the role of the municipality or local government who is tasked to render the service. So that's something that we have to be careful of in terms of the unintended consequences. In terms of advanced policy instruments, we see some of these being implemented. We see product bans being implemented. And again, This can work for specific products, although we have seen in Africa that very often you still get an illegal trade, for example, in carrier bags, even though you might ban them. And again, banning a product doesn't address the underlying failure in the waste management system. We have extended producer responsibility as a policy instrument, which many governments in Africa are starting to talk about. And this certainly does help in terms of transferring or shifting the burden from government to producers. And again, this can help for specific waste streams like plastic, but again, it doesn't address the complete underlying failure in the waste management system. And they also need to be implemented correctly. It's important that government doesn't see EPR as just another source of money for government. So in concluding, I believe we have to find ways to strengthen local government, to strengthen their ability to manage waste in general, plastic specifically, and also to find ways to scale up these different initiatives, while at the same time also working with producers of products to change their product design and to explore alternative delivery methods. Now, I mean, this is a complex issue. I've tried to simplify it here by just focusing on these two big drivers, but obviously it's going to require working on many fronts to solve plastic waste, from education and awareness all the way through to technology implementation. So I don't mean to try and portray that this is a very simple and quick problem to solve. It's going to require a lot of work, and it's going to require interventions on a number of fronts. So with that, I'm going to then pass back to you, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Yeah, if it had been a simple, easy question to resolve, then municipalities would not be in the trouble that they're in now. So, Percy, over to you. Briefly introduce yourself, and then if you'd make your contribution, we'd be delighted. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank the organizers also for the opportunity. My name is Percy Onianwa. I am the Executive Director of the Basel Convention Coordinating Center for the African region. The center is one of the several centers of the Basel Convention, which supports countries or parties to the convention with the implementation of the convention. We do this mostly through trainings, information sharing, special projects, and so on. Presently, with regards to plastic waste management, my center is supporting the Basel Secretariat with the implementation of a project in Ghana that is funded by the Norwegian Agency for Development. And in this project, we are supporting some international experts in trying to improve the situation in Ghana with respect to control of transboundary movement of plastic waste, environmentally sound management, as well as tackling sources. I have talked about transboundary movement of plastic waste. This appears to be one of the most important pillars of the Basel Convention. And I would like to speak today, especially on the issue of transboundary movement of waste across regions of the world. To start with, it is estimated that about 400 million tons of plastic waste are generated annually globally. And the overwhelming bulk of this, of course, is generated and used in the developing countries. But we find that post-consumption, we begin to have a redistribution of the ratio, with a significant shift moving from developed countries to developing ones. Why is this the case? We need to understand the nature of plastics and why this contributes to transboundary movement. Plastic essentially are intrinsically organic polymers, but in the process of manufacturing plastic materials, we usually have to add a lot of additives that are of chemical nature. Many of these additives are toxic in nature. And also, when plastics are used, we may have contaminants or residues of materials with which some of the plastics have been stored. So a combination of these contaminants and the additives make the post-consumption recycling of plastics really a very difficult issue, because if plastics are not recycled in environmentally sound manner, there is a tendency to mobilize the contaminants and the additives into the environment. It is very common for unsound practices such as disposal at sea, disposal on land, and burning of plastics in the open, which are very common in developing countries, to occur and contaminate the environment and damage human health. Now, there is a big difference between the state of management in developing countries and in developed countries. If we take developed countries, there are very stringent regulations with regards to how to recycle plastic wastes. And when you follow these processes, you're going to have to invest a lot of money in very expensive equipment and specialized manpower. And the general populace are aware of the toxicity of many of the pollutants that can derive from unsound management. Now, if you go to the developing countries, the exact opposite is the case. Very little awareness of the dangers of unsound management. In most countries, there are no specific laws on managing plastic waste. And even in the few countries where we have such laws, there's also the lack of capacity and the will to enforce these laws and regulations. Now, it's quite cheaper for the developed countries to move the plastics to where you have cheap labor in developing countries and where the regulations are less stringent. So a combination of all these factors serve as the driving force for the transboundary movement of plastic waste from the developed to the developing countries. Now, the trajectory of the movement has been mostly from the United States and the European countries to Asia, with a little movement also to Africa. There's some trade of plastic waste in Africa from the developed countries that I have mentioned. It is estimated that about 1.2 million tons of plastic waste are shipped from Europe annually to Asia, mostly to China as a country. Now, in these Asian countries, we have mostly small-scale recyclers that sometimes do not adhere to whatever local regulations there are. But what is really wrong with the transboundary movement, particularly when they are illegal under the Basel Convention, is to be understood by some of the provisions of the convention. For example, it is in the convention that for you to export, that as far as possible, hazardous waste that are generated anywhere should be treated as close as possible to the point at which the waste were generated, which means if you generate hazardous waste in a particular country, you treat the waste in that country as far as possible. The only grounds on which one should export any hazardous waste would be if the generating country itself does not have the capacity to so treat the waste, and the country to which one is exporting this has the capacity and is willing. Now, this combination of situations is not necessarily the case in many instances where we have had transboundary movement. I've indicated that China used to be the most important destination of plastic waste from developed countries. In 2018, there was a change because China then enacted very stringent regulations that made it impossible for these wastes to be any longer shipped into China. So a new market has to be looked for these wastes. Initially, the markets were the adjoining Southeast Asian countries of Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and so on. But gradually, these same Southeast Asian countries also began to enact their own stringent regulations. So now, many developed countries are beginning to find it difficult to ship their wastes. And this is where Africa becomes a possible target for dumping and for actual trades that may be legal. So it is important that Africa should be prepared to receive such wastes and prevent such waste from coming in. And it is in this regard that we need to be very, very well prepared. And there are reports already. Recently, there was some dumping of plastic waste in Asia. The illegal shipments are being rerouted using fake documents and so on to bypass the enforcing officers and enforcement officers and so on. Now, what is being done globally about control of transboundary movement? A lot, and I'll just take them at different levels. If we take the global or international level, the Basel Convention is the most active with respect to trying to control the shipment or transboundary movement of all hazardous waste. And that of plastic waste has become very, very unique in recent times. On January 1, 2021, that is this year, there was a new instrument, the Plastic Waste Amendment came into force. What the Plastic Waste Amendment has done is to move a large number of types of plastic waste that never were under the prior informed consent procedure of the Basel Convention, to move these now into a category where many plastics that were not controlled before will now be subject to the PIC procedure, which makes them more difficult because there will now be notifications sent to imports and exports, as well as very stringent standards. The issue of new standards have to be met with respect to the levels of contaminations and additives that are in the plastic materials before shipments can be made. Under the Basel Convention also, we have the ban amendment that came into force in 2019. The ban amendment prohibits the export from OECD countries and EU countries and like Liechtenstein to all hazardous waste to developing countries such as Africa and those in Asia and so on. So if this is enforced, of course, it will reduce transboundary movement. And it is worthy of note that many European countries have actually, even before the amendments came into force, passed the contents of the amendment into their domestic legislation. There's also generally a lot of international action of countries supporting other countries, partnerships being formed, and so on. Regionally, we have the Bamako Convention, even though not all African countries are presently have ratified or even signed onto it. But the Bamako Convention, if more countries sign into it, is a very important convention that also prohibits the movement of hazardous waste from any part of the world into Africa. And then at the national level, in recent times, many countries have started having policies, formulating specified special policies and regulations targeted specifically at plastic waste management. There used to be in many countries general policies and regulations for managing solid waste in general, but because plastic waste has suddenly become of global and urgent importance, many countries are now formulating policies and making new regulations to control plastic waste management and include in this the control of transboundary movement of plastic waste. In 2020, Nigeria and Ghana actually passed their own policies with respect to the management of plastic waste. Also very important is the fact that the plastic waste amendment that I mentioned requires that countries have to specify new standards I'm not aware yet that any African countries have specified its own standard in line with the plastic waste amendment, which will govern the possibility of any shipment of plastic waste into such countries. Because what the plastic waste amendment did is to exempt some categories of plastic waste. These can be shipped, but even when shipping them, you still have to meet certain stringent standards to ensure that they are not contaminated at a significant level. Then it is important that there should be inventory of plastics imports and exports within a given country. And also there were certain in the regional zones, there used to be dump watches in West Africa, in East Africa, by which there could be intelligence, some of which is supported by Interpol and the World Customs Organization, both of which have been also very active with respect to the control of transboundary movement. I think I will just stop here and see if I can respond to questions that may relate to some of the things I have mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Percy. It seems to me that to a large extent, the Basel Convention is to plastics what CITES is to animals and plant species that are rare and endangered. So very good to know that. And obviously a key player in the development of national and regional action plans. So I look forward to working with you more closely. Right, we go over now to the questions and answer session, and hopefully this is going to take off the way it did last week. If Tara hadn't stopped it last week, I think it might still be carrying on. So Tara, could you manage the questions from now on?
Of course. There was a question sent in French that says, thank you for the communication. What is the current position of the European Union and the United States on the problem of plastic waste? Do they think that this plastic waste is considered reusable, and which is why it's sent to underdeveloped countries, or should it be their place to develop mechanisms and units for elimination of the waste? Percy, I don't know if you want to comment on that from the perspective of Basel.
I didn't get it. I was trying to read one of the questions. Sorry, if you don't mind.
Oh, sorry. It was sent through in French, so I've just translated it.
Okay. Can you do that?
Sure. So it says, what is the current position of the European Union and the United States on the problem of plastic waste? And do they think that the waste is considered reusable to be sent to underdeveloped countries? Or should it be their place to develop mechanisms and units for the elimination of the waste?
Yeah, I think these developed countries that you have just mentioned have been playing a dual role, in the sense that they have legislations that actually prohibit, that support the local management of the plastics in environmentally sound manner, that prohibits the export to developing countries of such plastic waste because they are hazardous. They also have those that promote the export of plastic waste legally to countries where they can be soundly managed. However, apparently the amount of plastics that are generated in these countries far exceeds still the capacity of the countries to handle them. So exporting for recycling is one of the options open. And what has been happening is that it's surprising, but it happens with other wastes like e-waste. It's the export is prohibited, but it is still occurring, as if the exporting countries sometimes close their eyes. That's what it begins to look at, because you find also that when some of the cases are brought into the open, the prosecution process takes so long to deal with. This is a problem that governs, that occurs in all kinds of hazardous waste streams that we have experienced in the Basel Convention systems. And what has been done is that there have been series of projects that have been targeted at dealing with a kind of cooperation between Europe and Africa, between Europe and Asia, to stem the flow of the waste. But otherwise, based on the principles of environmental conservation, which is practiced in these countries, they have laws that can prohibit, but they will also need to expand their capacity to be able to cope with and recycle or find other ways of managing the amount of waste that are generated in these developed countries. Thank you.
Thanks. Linda, would you like to also participate in answering this question? Because I think you've got a different perspective as well.
Thanks, Tony. So I think that there were a couple of issues in that question itself. First of all, does Europe and the US see plastic as a resource that can be recycled? And then the second part of that was around sending it to developing countries. So I think on the first part, even on that, we're seeing big differences between the USA and the EU. Even pre-COVID, we'd seen a large number of big recycling facilities in the US shut down because it just wasn't economically viable, because they've never been able to implement extended producer responsibility for packaging in the US because it's implemented at the state level as opposed to at the federal level. So they've never really been able to create an economically viable plastic recycling industry locally within the US. Europe, for example, has been driving a very strong waste and circular economy kind of policy agenda. But having said that, they've still for many years been exporting their plastic waste, as with a number of other waste streams, to Asia and Southeast Asia for reprocessing. And certainly China's ban made them look really hard at bringing that recycling activity back on shore. But again, the reason they were exporting it was because it just wasn't economically viable to do it in the EU, because minimum wages are just so much higher in developed countries, for example. So it was easy just to export this. And I think that's when it links to the second point of that question around essentially dumping these waste streams onto developing countries. And it's kind of been done under this disguise of, well, we're creating jobs in developing countries. We're doing good for the developing countries because we're giving them this recyclable material. But in fact, it has just purely been dumping because they haven't been able to establish local economically viable recycling industries. So again, I think we need to be very careful around this. Certainly in the global study that was done, the Breaking the Plastic Wave study, one of the principal considerations in the model was that a developed country could send their waste to another developed country for processing because they had the policy, they had the infrastructure, etc. But a developed country should not send to a middle income, or say a high income should not send to a middle income should not send to a low income. So you cannot cascade down the transboundary movement of plastic waste, because by doing that, you're sending it to a country that most likely does not have the regulatory environment in place, the enforcement environment in place, and most likely does not have the recycling infrastructure in place. So I think many of these countries now need to look really hard at how they establish their own local recycling economies and how they make it economically viable to deal with at source. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Linda. There's another question that says, through an integrated approach, can the Abidjan Convention, in collaboration with Linda, Thomas, and Percy, and other technical experts with assistance from institutions, come up with a technical roadmap on the management of plastic bags within the African region? This may include strategic phasing out processes of plastic production from manufacturers in the African continent. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Well, I think, Tara, I think this links also very closely to the next question, which we can still deal with in more detail later. I don't want to undermine the next question afterwards with regards to the the sort of temporary lockdown on plastics. But my sense is that there may not be a single solution for the African continent. And I think Thomas touched on this in one of the responses that he gave, a written response before he had to leave, unfortunately. You know, while it may make sense to, let's say, ban plastic carrier bags in Kenya, it may not necessarily make sense to ban them in South Africa, because the policy approach taken here was to drive towards 100% recycled content in carrier bags, because a life cycle sustainability assessment had been done, which showed that thicker plastic carrier bags, in fact, had a lower environmental, social, and economic impact. So a thicker plastic bag was a better option as opposed to a paper bag or a cotton bag, etc. So again, it's going to be very much, I think, country specific in terms of what the local conditions are. Do you have a local recycling industry that can absorb the material? Do you have the regulations, etc., in place? So I think, I mean, a roadmap would be useful in terms of highlighting the suite of interventions which could be taken. In fact, I'm happy to share a paper which I published, I think 2 years ago, on plastic for developing countries. Should we ban it, replace it, whatever, which showed that, you know, it's going to require a suite of interventions. There isn't just one solution to dealing with plastic. And each country is almost going to have to look at their own conditions and say, out of these 5 interventions that we can take, which of these make sense for our specific country? So I think that's, I don't know if I actually answered the question. I think it would be useful to have a roadmap, but it might not necessarily be, this is going to be it for every country in Africa. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. Percy, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I do agree with Linda that it's possible to think of a roadmap, perhaps a combination of all the experiences of different countries that may have already placed a ban on such plastic materials would enhance the production of such a roadmap. But I can tell easily that it will be one that will engage a very wide spectrum of stakeholders and a lot of awareness raising activities to ensure that the people really understand the reason why such materials need to be removed from circulation. And as he has pointed out, we find that people, if you actually produce carrier bags that are much thicker, this can essentially help to reduce the turnaround, I mean, the rate at which carrier packaging material and packaging materials are littered around the environment. And some pilot projects have been going on in various countries, trying to reason out and execute activities that can encourage the community to begin to adjust to other types of carrier bag systems, like those made from cotton and some other local materials. And in some cases this has worked, and in some it just has not worked. But it is possible to think of a roadmap which should be carefully thought out with respect to the peculiar circumstances of each country. Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. I think we'll move on to the other question from Barbara that Linda referred to, that says, do you think there will be a need to pause all plastic production temporarily in Africa or any importation of waste to give each country an opportunity to put a plan in place? This will give each country the opportunity to use the current plastic in circulation, be it new plastics or waste, until a draft plan is in place, a kind of lockdown until an action plan for waste management systems are in place or markets for plastic waste have been created in a reuse market.
I'm happy to respond to that one. Just don't take it down, because there are just so many issues in that particular question that were raised that I don't want to lose them. I think, first of all, we've got to remember that obviously plastic production is a lot more than just single-use plastic. Plastic is being produced for the automotive industry, for the agricultural industry, etc. So I don't think that we can just stop production of plastic because, you know, because it is applied in just so many sectors where it stays in use for a long time. I mean, it can stay in a vehicle for 20 years or 30 years kind of thing. So the focus here is very much on the short-lived plastic, on the single-use plastics, which are consumed pretty quickly and then enter into the waste stream. I think that we certainly can look at this issue of importation of waste. I do believe that African countries do need to be focusing on their own waste streams before they start considering just importing from other. And I know certainly in South Africa, since China closed their doors and since then Malaysia and a number of other countries have started sending plastic waste back, we've started, you know, South Africa, for example, has started receiving requests to take plastic from other countries. And fortunately, our government has always engaged with our recycling industry to say, before we approve this, do you have the capacity to accept it? And our stance has always been, we need to deal with our own plastic within South Africa before we start dealing with plastic from other countries. So I think certainly on the importation, that's something we can strongly look at. The point around saying, well, you know, if we had a lockdown to allow countries the opportunity to use their current plastic first, I think this speaks to the point that Tony raised, is that there's no point just collecting plastic for recycling if you don't have an end-use recycling industry. So the plastic has to go somewhere. And sometimes that takes time. You know, I know Kenya, for example, has set up Petco Kenya to deal with the PET plastic bottles. And it can take, you know, 5 years, 10 years to get to establish a recycling industry that can actually take the plastic. So you can't necessarily just start this overnight to say, well, let's stop the import of plastic and we'll just start recycling our own. Because you need the private sector to invest in the recycling infrastructure. You need the collection systems. Thankfully, in Africa, we have a very active informal waste sector that plays a very important role in collecting recyclable materials. But again, you've got to bring producers in, you've got to bring the private sector in, and you've got to create these recycling industries. Now, for some countries, they don't generate enough plastic waste to warrant investment in a local recycling industry. And that's where we've spoken about the idea of regional recycling economies. And I think this touches on the work that Percy spoke about in terms of transboundary movement of plastic, because it might make sense, for example, to have a SADC or a Southern Africa plastic recycling economy and a West Africa plastic recycling economy, where plastic waste does move. Let's say it moves from Ghana to Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana, wherever you set up the recycling infrastructure that gives you the economies of scale to invest in the infrastructure, but making sure that you have the checks and balances in terms of transboundary movement. So it is critical that we also look at growing our own plastic recycling economy. But you know, again, a point that I can spend a lot of time, but I don't want to, is that its investment in the waste sector is just considered high risk in Africa. The private sector is reluctant to invest in infrastructure and technology, unfortunately. So again, we have to, as governments, we have to be looking at incentivizing this and a whole host of other things, which I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I think there's just so much in that one question that Barbara has asked. But my gut feel is that we can't just have a lockdown. There's certain plastic products that we need for safe water, for safe food to consumers. And again, it's not just single use, it is used in other applications. Thanks.
Percy, would you like to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I think Linda has done justice to that, but I seriously agree with her that a lockdown will do no good, particularly if it is very sudden. We won't die from a lockdown if it's sudden, but there'll be a lot of suffering. There are lots of single-use plastic materials that people just use once and throw away and have never been recycled. And alternatives have to be created for these, and recycling systems have then to be created. Otherwise, you create a kind of scarcity that will make people have to go through behavior adjustment situations. There's always anytime you talk about plastics management, the question of bans and so on tends to come to mind quickly, but we always try to advise that people have to think of circular economy and not necessarily think that everything should involve just a ban. Behavior modifications can help, and replacement of creation of alternatives and so on. There are some of these kinds of projects that we are beginning to try to put in place even in some African countries. For example, as part of the projects we are undertaking in Ghana, you will know that one of the commonest problems now in Africa with respect to packaging of drinking water is the use of the sachet, the water sachets that litter the streets of urban areas in most African countries. We are thinking that we can have pilot programs to create water ATMs. Essentially, we will again be using some kind of plastic materials, most likely, for refilling the ATM, but of course, this will be harder, more stable, more resilient plastics that we can reuse and reuse for much longer time. Will the average man on the street and woman on the street easily buy into the sudden ban or lockdown on the use of the water sachet systems? It will take a lot of time. So there should be adequate, whenever we want to do this kind of replacement or change of the situation of what people are familiar with use to plastic materials, there should be adequate stakeholder engagement to let people understand the reasons and adjust, take some time to adjust to the possibility of whatever hardships may ensure. Thank you.
I think, Tara, if I may as well, just to follow on, Percy raised a very important point here. And it speaks to, I think, the two previous questions, you know, the roadmap and the lockdown, is that I think in my mind, what every country actually needs to do is to identify what the specific problematic plastic products are. That's the first step in my mind. So, you know, certainly the issue of the water sachets that we see used in West Africa, we don't see them used a lot, for example, in Southern Africa. So again, there are these behavioral and cultural influences in different countries and different regions of the continent, which results in different problematic single-use plastics. So the starting point would be to identify which are these, which are the top 3 to 5 single-use plastic products, and then on those specific products, engage with the producers of those products to say, you know, what are the options? Either the producers come to the party, or we just simply ban them. But as Percy rightly said, there's always an unintended consequence of a ban, and sometimes it's a knee-jerk reaction. But I can also understand sometimes why governments want to do it. And to start having the discussions to say, are there other ways of getting water to consumers that uses less plastic in the case of the water sachets? Or are there ways that consumers can carry their goods home from the market as opposed to single-use carrier bags? So for each one of these problematic single-use plastic products, to ask the question, is there another way that we can deliver that product to a consumer that requires less plastic? And I think that for me is the starting point of any roadmap for a country. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's another question that says, why is the Bamako Convention not well known and followed? Percy, I don't know if you want to comment on that first.
That's a very, very interesting but very commonly asked question. many African countries, including some of the very big ones, I won't mention names, have not ratified the Bamako Convention. If you attend a meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the Convention, you will be looking around for some of the well-known giants, and they are not there, or they are just there as observers. I don't know what the number is now, but I'm not sure that up to half of the countries in Africa have ratified the convention, though it's already in force, and at least 3 conferences of the parties have been held. The reason appears to me to be that most of the countries have already ratified and are party members of the Basel Convention, which essentially has the same provisions as the Bamako Convention, except that the Bamako Convention does not make any excuses for export from developed countries into Africa. It just prohibits all exports. Okay, and it also encourages international, inter-African trade. That needs to be well understood, because some people have reasoned that if we establish, just like Linda was pointing out, there's always been this talk about the possibility of establishing regional recycling centers for different waste streams, that perhaps we will also have difficulties of supplying such recycling facilities with waste from other countries if these centers will serve as sub-regional recycling points. It does not prohibit intra-African trade, but it clearly prohibits. But because also the Basel Convention is beginning to make provisions such as the plastic waste amendment, the ban amendment, and so on, which also tends to, because if you take the Basel Convention and add to it the plastic waste, I mean the ban amendment, which prohibits all form of exports of waste destined for disposal from practically all developed countries into Africa, you almost seems as if you've got the Bamako Convention. I think there is that lethargy that they already have what they want in the Basel Convention, but it's very important that the Bamako Convention should still be, because there may still be room for certain kinds of interpretations of what is hazardous and what is not hazardous on a regional basis, which is allowed under the Basel Convention. The African region can do its own. It can increase setting, for example, now that they have to set standards for contaminant levels in plastics, it can be done at a regional level using the Bamako Convention meetings and so on. So it's true, it's not as popular as the Basel Convention, but it should be. And all efforts are being made, I hope so, by UNEP. UNEP also supports and helps to communicate the information to encourage parties, I mean countries in Africa to become parties to the convention. Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. Linda, would you like to comment?
I think Percy's done a great job in answering that one. I've got nothing more to add on that. Thank you.
All right. There's another question written in French for you, Linda, that says, is the absence of plastic waste in schools, education programs in some African countries one of the primary factors driving pollution?
Well, I think, you know, not only education around plastic waste, I think certainly it speaks to the broader issue of waste management. You know, I've always said plastic is just an indicator of an underlying waste management problem. So I think certainly we need to be looking at how we introduce waste management, education and awareness around waste management in general to create more environmentally aware and conscious consumers and certainly households. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done on raising the level of awareness to support behavior change around what products people buy and why people think that it's just acceptable to drop something in the street or on the sidewalk after they use it. So yeah, I think it would be wonderful to see more in terms of education from the youngest of levels all the way through into the research environment as well. And certainly I know a number of countries are looking at or have established as part of degrees and postgraduate degrees components around waste management. But I mean, this needs to start at the youngest of grade 1 levels in terms of raising awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's another question from Abdullah that says, if China's decision to ban the import of plastic waste was followed by another decision to ban the removal of plastic from China, do you think that the level of plastic pollution would be the same overall in the world? Percy, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I have been looking at that question and racking my head what exactly to say. It's looking more like a mathematical kind of thing, almost like having a lockdown. Nobody moves plastics from one part of the world to another. Will it lead to less pollution? Most likely not. In the immediate terms, not. Because the countries that, in the developing countries, still have inadequate capacity to properly manage the plastic waste in environmentally sound manners. So most likely they will continue with that. And of course, remember, we have not said anything about a lockdown in production of more plastics. And trade in new plastics is continuing. You're talking of shipment of plastic waste not going on, which means the European communities and US will have a saturation of plastics that they cannot recycle due to inadequate capacity, not inadequate know-how, inadequate capacity to handle all of the wastes. And then you will begin certainly to have leakages. One way or the other, there will just be a natural tendency to deal with the waste. You cannot keep all that millions of tons of plastic waste in Europe. Something will just have to give. And I think it will end up in some kind of pollution because you cannot in the short term increase the capacity to recycle those wastes. And in the case of the developing countries, like I said, the capacity has not been there. And there may not be increased pollution arising from the developing countries. It may just be at the level at which it is. But for the developed countries, there will be a strain on the system to manage their waste. And I'm sure it will lead to some leakage and cause some form of pollution. That's my reasoning. Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. Linda, would you like to comment?
I think, Tara, can you just repeat the question? Because I was kind of struggling to understand what they were asking.
So the question came through in the chat, which says, if China's decision to ban the import of plastic waste was followed by another decision to ban the removal of plastic from China, do you think the level of plastic pollution would be the same in the world? So I think he's referring to the circular economy here, in a sense, saying that if they also stop producing plastic, would the level of plastic pollution decrease because we would be forced to use the current plastic that's polluted?
Sure. Okay. So I think
it was a bit provocative compared to the fact that China is one of the
it's talking about plastic waste
product, and that sending plastic waste there was a kind of return to the sender. It was a
Sure. So I think as far as I understand, I mean, China's ban wasn't necessarily an outright ban. It was very much linked to quality of the material that was received. So I think China sort of reached the point of saying, well, they're receiving a lot of plastic waste but as part of it, there's a lot of waste in what they're receiving that actually just was not recyclable, and they were then sitting with this environmental burden coming back again from Europe or from North America or whatever. So it was more around kind of the quality, setting the quality controls in place in terms of what they were prepared to accept and what not. I think certainly on the issue of manufacturing, and I think, you know, there's a huge engine behind the plastics industry, which I think is looking for new markets all of the time. So they're obviously looking at what more can they make out of plastic. And part of the reason is that in terms of oil, you know, we've seen a big move away from combustion engines and petrol and diesel based vehicles towards electric vehicles, towards renewable energy. So in the long term, the demand for oil is declining, and obviously oil producers around the world are saying, well, can we find other markets for this material? And so the plastics industry is an attractive one. The petrochemical industry and plastics production is an attractive alternative for the use of oil. So they're looking at still sustaining the same amount of kind of oil production, but looking for new markets, and plastic is a low-hanging fruit. So, you know, I think this is something that we do have to address in the long term, is that we can't just be producing plastic for the sake of plastic production. There are many products, and I think it was one of the questions that was raised somewhere, I think in one of the chat boxes. You know, there are many products where it just absolutely doesn't make sense to produce it. You know, you find the most ridiculous things made in plastic sometimes, but yet on the other hand, there are products that are very necessary in terms of safe food and safe water, and as I said, in the longer lived, in, you know, the agricultural sector, in the automotive sector as well. So I don't know how countries you know, are more cautious in terms of what products actually find their way onto the local market. And perhaps a tool like extended producer responsibility is a very useful one, because it comes with a cost to the producer. And if the cost is higher than the value of the product, you know, then hopefully they'll stop putting silly products. You know, we always see, for example, retailers who have these kind of marketing gimmicks that you get free toys or free stickers or free things when you buy something, and you look at it and you go, you know, seriously, did I really need to get this? Did this really need to be made out of plastic? Is anyone actually going to ever use this, or are they going to get home and throw it straight into the dustbin? So again, I think we have to be very careful in terms of just producing things for the sake of producing it, because it has given plastic a bad reputation, and the more we do this, the worse that reputation is going to get. And then we get this knee-jerk reaction of saying, well, let's just ban all plastic, which I don't think is feasible. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
Thanks, Linda.
I can further add to that, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Having spoken about transboundary movement of plastic waste, actually it needs to be noted that transboundary movement is allowed because it's actually very necessary in some cases. There are actually also movements from developing countries to developed countries to service certain power industries and so on, but also for recycling purposes. For example, one problematic types or class of plastic waste is the class that is associated with e-wastes. Most of the plastics that we find in e-waste contain brominated flame retardants, which are very hazardous. And local recyclers in Africa do not know how to handle these, don't have the capacity. So ultimately, the treatment process is to, when these plastics are extracted from the e-waste materials, they usually sometimes have to ship them out for very specialized recycling. Otherwise, they just bury them or burn them. So preventing transboundary movement in this direction will increase the burden of pollution that we can derive from certain classes of plastic waste that we may not be able to treat well in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. There's another question that says, if there's plastic around the country, but not as much as developed countries, since we do not have as many industries which produce plastic items, how can we prevent plastic pollution before the industries arrive while the government is not aware of the plastic pollution?
I didn't hear that too well, or maybe.
Sorry, Percy. They were asking if there's plastic around the country as litter, but not as much as developed countries, due to the fact that they don't have industries producing plastic items in their country. How can they prevent plastic pollution before industries arrive while the government is not aware of plastic pollution? Would you like to comment on that first, Percy?
No, maybe Linda should comment. I don't particularly get the question correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very tricky one, Tara. I mean, I was going to respond and say, well, it's useful if government can start to send signals with regards to plastic, that we don't have just a flood of plastic products onto the market, some of which may be unnecessary. But if you're sitting with a government that is not aware of plastic pollution and plastic being a problem, then the question kind of becomes, well, who is the regulator? Who is it that actually sends those signals in terms of we're not prepared for this to get out of control, or to reach a point where we're now seeing significant plastic pollution? And I suppose in the absence of government, the question then becomes, do you have strong community-based organizations, civil society organizations who can play that voice? I think the one thing about plastic, just in the last 5 years, we've seen a heightened sense of public awareness around plastic pollution. We've seen those images of the turtles and the seabirds, and they're very emotive images, and so this does raise awareness, and I believe that it has placed additional pressure onto producers of manufacturers and producers and brand owners in terms of what they're putting onto the market. I can think of a few cases where retailers changed products to plastic, and within 24 hours, the backlash on social media to the point where the retailer took those products down. So again, I think this comes back to one of the earlier points around education and awareness and empowering consumers to also play an active role in terms of the products that are put onto the market. But again, very importantly, making sure that they are informed around those products. This knee-jerk reaction that we see around plastic in South Africa, for example, about 2 years ago, I think it was, we saw a number of retailers changing to biodegradable plastics. And I kept getting messages from friends and family members saying, isn't this fantastic? This company has just brought out, they're now packaging their bread or their whatever in biodegradable plastic. And on face value, it may look great, but we know that so many products labeled biodegradable aren't biodegradable. Some of them are, oxo-biodegradable, that they just fragment into smaller pieces, but it never goes away. Some of them will biodegrade under very specific industrial composting facilities that we don't have on the African continent. So again, some retailers and brand owners have tried to kind of confuse consumers that they're taking a greener option. I mean, I remember buying something recently that was clearly in packaging, and I was told, you don't need to worry about this. This is not plastic. And the retailer themselves didn't know, what in fact, because they had been told by somebody that this is not plastic. But it clearly was. So again, we have to make sure that we have a very educated and aware society. And in the absence of government playing this leadership role, then also empowering citizens to also say, we won't actually accept this. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Percy, I don't know if you want to comment at all on that question?
Yeah, I had the same idea that the onus will be on the civil society organizations in the country to as they have always done, monitor the environment and take proactive actions when cases of dumping, such as is described, occur. The truth is that in Nigeria, for example, and I guess it's the same in many other countries, there are now very, very many NGOs that are into environmental issues, and they are very well organized, and they are in practically every part of the country. And they have been engaging government proactively to take actions in terms of environmental management, such that it won't be too difficult for any situation such as has been described to come to the knowledge of such NGOs, as they have far-reaching tentacles among communities and so on. Even at levels of that are not community levels, issues of international levels, the NGOs have also been engaging government. For example, in Nigeria, during January, shortly after the plastic waste amendments came into force, the NGO forum, a forum of NGOs, or a forum of several NGOs, required me to study certain regulations in Nigeria to see the extent to which they had addressed the issue of the plastic waste amendments, and to determine what the readiness of Nigeria was to domesticate the plastic waste amendment. And they were going to make a case to government on the issue of preparedness to tackle the plastic waste amendment issue properly and comply with the requirements. So the NGOs are actually doing a lot to help environmental monitoring and other actions positively. Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. I think we have time for one more question. The rest we will respond to in text. There's another question that says, talking about illegal transboundary moving of toxic waste from developed to developing countries, is it a serious problem as it relates to Africa? What is the percentage components of illegal waste dumped in Africa that relates to marine pollution in African oceans? I'll pause there. Would anyone? It's a rather long question. Would anyone like to comment on this so far?
Yeah, I can comment on that, but I cannot give the statistics of components of the question. The question is it a serious problem? Yeah, it is. Plastic waste comes in a variety of forms. They may come as simple plastic materials or scraps and so on. And a lot of it also comes in form of e-waste. I have just spoken about plastics associated with e-waste. A lot of e-waste is exported into African countries, especially West Africa. And every one of these has plastic materials that we have to deal with.
Des matières plastiques auxquelles
2015 to 2017 of imports of e-waste into Nigeria through one of the cities, Lagos. We found that about 60,000 tons were imported annually of used e-waste, of which 15,000 tons were outright end-of-life e-waste, all of which contain plastics that we have to deal with, and we do not have the capacity. Apart from that, there are actually very many small contractors who still surreptitiously cooperate with foreigners to bring in waste, some of which are mixed, so it doesn't necessarily have to be only plastic materials, but maybe co-mixed with other kinds of waste like paper, like household waste, and so on. We get all kinds of terrible experiences of these kinds of imports. We do not know the degree to which this is going on until we read some reports by Interpol and World Custom Organization that have been carrying out regular annual exercises of intercepting shipments of waste from one part of the world to another. A lot of it is, of course, destined for Asia, but a large quantity is also coming into Africa. There's a 2020 report that has highlighted the fact that since the ban, we can call it a ban on shipments to some parts of Asia, that's China and some Southeast Asian countries, that's a lot of plastic waste is being shipped and rerouted to Africa and Latin American countries. So we should not take for granted that perhaps this is not as significant and fold our arms. We are essentially emphasizing the retraining and retraining of customs, the enactment and enforcement of our local legislations to be able to cope with transboundary movement. We are a potential target, a potential destination for dumping of what does not go to China. So we need to be on our guard. Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. Linda, would you like to comment on the first section of the question?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, as Percy has said now, I think this problem is going to get worse and worse for Africa. I think, you know, countries are going to, it's going to become more difficult for countries to find somewhere else to go and dump the waste material. And I think I mentioned it last week, I'll mention it again today. You know, I always say waste flows from a country with weak legislation, from a country with strong legislation to a country with weak legislation. And unfortunately, many African countries just haven't put a strong waste regulatory environment in place. And then secondly, the enforcement of that regulatory environment, which makes Africa very susceptible to transboundary movement. You know, I don't think we're ever going to have reliable figures on this, because most of the time this is illegal transboundary movement, and trust me, they're not going to be reporting that to anybody. So there are probably significant tonnages coming onto the continent that are just not recorded anywhere. So again, we have to look at, particularly for countries along the coastline of Africa, you know, we have to look at checks and balances for these countries to make sure that they have better control of what is coming into ports. And I think thirdly, just having said that, I think certainly West Africa and North Africa is probably at greater risk to this dumping because of its proximity to the US, to Europe, for example, and any kind of ships coming back from Asia where plastic waste may have been rejected and returned. You know, it's an easy dumping ground on the way back. So I think certainly we've seen it as a big problem in West Africa for electronic waste. So those shipment routes already exist. And I do hope, I think, Percy, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think Nigeria just recently enacted new waste legislation and plastic legislation, which is great to see. So I think certainly those West African countries really need to be aware of the fact that they're likely to see increasing illegal and legal transboundary movement of waste and plastic waste coming into their region. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. So the second part of the question was what can be done by the Abidjan Convention to try and address this issue. So from your answer, I'm assuming you're referring specifically to focusing on the coastal countries and looking at legislation and stricter enforcement at the ports.
Yeah, I think in terms of the low-hanging fruit, again, making sure that there is a consistent regulatory environment, you know, that neighboring countries have, you know, very similar regulations, that there isn't a weakness in any one country compared to the next. So making sure that there is a strong regulatory foundation, that there is enforcement of the regulations. And then I know one of the biggest challenges is that they literally cannot go through every container that arrives in the port. So again, how do you empower the ports control, the ports authority, Is there technology that can be used to scan containers? Do they need to do random checks and enforcement? And then what are the consequences? Is there a consequence of illegal import or trade, for example, and dumping of waste? So I think those for me would be the starting point, and then obviously capacitating the governments as well. It goes back to one of the previous questions of what happens if you have a government that is not aware of the plastic pollution problem, although in 2021, I still find that surprising if there is a government that is not aware that, that there is a plastic pollution problem. But if that is the case, then again, how do we build capacity in, all tiers of government, from national or federal level all the way down to local government? Thank you.
I can add to that with respect to an institution that unfortunately has gone moribund, and that's the dump watch systems of the sub-regional communities. For example, in West Africa, some dumping that has occurred in the past arose from lack of communication amongst the countries. One country is often alerted by Interpol or the World Customs Organization of a shipment of the waste destined to its ports, and one way or the other it manages to intercept this, or the ship gets rerouted to another country without that first country being able to communicate directly with the regulatory agency of a neighboring country. At a point, there was the idea to establish what we call Maes, the West African Network for Compliance and Enforcement and Regulatory Agencies, which will have brought all the regulatory agencies together and the enforcement agencies under a network through which they can communicate to pass information about possible illegal shipments. Unfortunately, this did not survive. There was Impel, which is the equivalent organization in Europe, attempted to support West Africa to establish that kind of organization. I know there was also an attempt to do this for the East African region, but that kind of organization will certainly help to coordinate activities amongst customs officials, amongst the Navy, amongst the regulatory agencies and the local naval police and so on, to ensure that shipments can be intercepted, in addition to local actions and training of customs officials. So that communication, that network can help a lot. It's in this regard that the Abidjan Convention can also help to, somebody needs to find a way to reactivate this kind of sub-regional networks around Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Percy. I'm afraid I think that's all the questions we have time for. I'm going to hand over to Tony now, just to wrap things up for us today. Go ahead, Tony.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed to the panelists. Really superb. And what I found particularly exciting is the level of questions, both last week and today. Not just the level, but the number. And it actually reminds me to point out to all of the participants and those with whom you associate that a really important objective of this program is not simply to develop best practices, but to take those and to develop a decision-making framework that can guide people in answering the sorts of questions that you have. What is it that we should do, or the country should do, or the region should do when we find ourselves in this situation, we have these resources and so forth. So please think about how you might contribute to the development not only of best practices, but also to the action plan. Next week, we are having a really, starting off a really good session in which Dose Steyn from South Africa is actually going to be leading it. And its terms, and he starts, the title of the talk is Actions for Producers and Converters at the Heart of the Plastics Industry. And that actually now is getting into what should it be that producers and converters do, and how should they contribute, and this answers some of your questions also, how should they contribute to the development of action plans within different countries and within regions. And he's giving a South African perspective, but I'm delighted to announce that we are in the process of actually securing a West African counter to that, indicating how the perspectives in the two different places, in fact, differ. And please attend that. It's going to be really exciting. And if the level and the number of questions are, oh, there we are. Thank you very much. And if the level of the questions are much the same as they are today, it's going to be an exciting period next week. So thank you all very much indeed. And we're going to see you again.
Sorry, Tony, can I interrupt?
Sorry, it's not correct next week, it's Thursday. Yeah.
Correct, correct, it's Thursday.
Yeah. Yeah, my humble apologies. The week has run away with me, obviously. Yes, it's the day after tomorrow, Thursday. Thanks very much for that. And to all of you, thanks once again. See you not next week. Well, we will see you next week, but we'll see you tomorrow, the day after tomorrow as well, Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Abdullah, would you like to say anything before we sign off?
It's okay, thank you. Tu as été merveilleux, Tony. Les invités ont été aussi excellents. Nous avons suivi d'excellentes présentations, notamment sur les difficultés auxquelles nous faisons face aujourd'hui, notamment sur les engagements qui sont pris au niveau international et qui ont du mal à être mis en œuvre. J'ai vu beaucoup de commentaires expliquant les retards qui ont été accusés par le continent, notamment à travers le mouvement des produits dangereux dans le cadre de la Convention de Bamako, qui a encore du mal à être mise en œuvre comme les pays l'ont souhaité au moment où la Convention était mise entrée en vigueur en 1997. Mais comme nous nous en rendons tous compte depuis quelques années, disons à peu près depuis 2017, le mouvement a repris avec vigueur tout ce qui tourne autour de la lutte contre la pollution plastique et le continent africain est en train de jouer sa part. C'est pour ça que ce processus-là, ces webinaires que nous conduisons là dans le cadre de la Convention d'Abidjan se veut inclusif, en faisant participer aussi bien l'industrie que les experts, les chercheurs, la société civile, les municipalités et les pouvoirs publics des États, parce que rien ne pourra se faire sans qu'on mette ensemble, bien sûr, toutes ces parties prenantes-là. Et bien sûr, nous osons espérer, comme je l'avais marqué en commentaire, que ces études-là, comme les conférenciers l'ont démontré aujourd'hui, vont pouvoir nous conduire vers une caractérisation précise en termes de quantité, en termes de qualité, en termes de nature des déchets qui existent pour pouvoir tout simplement imaginer une économie circulaire qui soit efficiente, qui soit pertinente en matière de gestion des pollutions plastiques. Je vous remercie, comme Tony l'a dit, donc la Convention d'Abidjan et l'African Marine Western Network et Sustainable Seas Trust vous donnent rendez-vous donc jeudi prochain pour la prochaine conférence. Il y aura beaucoup d'autres qui vont arriver. Il nous reste à peu près 18 conférences qui vont arriver. L'Afrique de l'Ouest, l'Afrique centrale seront aussi présentes. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Thank you, Abdullah, and thank you, Linda and Percy, for your time this afternoon. I think we'll end it here. For those who did send questions, we will pass those on to the panelists and get back to you with an answer via email. Thank you, everyone.